to Intro to Philosophy 1010. This is the final video for part 3 of our book, which is the 4 fundamental questions, and this question is, what can I know? So this last essay for this section is by Alice Crary, and it's called The Question of Silence, Feminist Theory and Women's Voices. So this, it's a good essay to conclude part 3 with, because she brings up a lot of issues that we dealt with earlier in part 3. So what can I know? What is it possible for a human being to know? What is knowledge? What is reason? So she brings these up, but what I see, what confuses me about this reading is that on the one hand, Alice Crary wants to defend reason and philosophy against certain other feminist theorists, because Alice Crary is also a feminist theory maker. But she points out how some other feminists criticize the entire sphere of reason as entirely corrupted, or if not corrupted, just inescapably biased by male thinking. That the whole history of philosophy, the whole history of reason, and that's a nebulous word. I like Immanuel Kant's definition of it, and we can go over that. That certain feminists say, oh, men and women just think differently. And the way the history of philosophy has developed has been dominated by men, and therefore it does not really apply to women. So Alice Crary will say, yeah, I'll grant you there are obvious biases in language, such as, for example, mankind. You know, why are all humans referred to as man? That's kind of an obvious thing, and there are probably subtler biases, male biases, in our language and the way we determine what is true, when a sentence is valid or not. All of those rules of logic. There may or may not be biases there, says Alice Crary, and that's what she's criticizing. How come you just assume the entire process of thinking as it's developed on planet Earth has been corrupted? She's saying that's probably not the case. There probably is a space of reasons men and women share, and we have to do the more difficult task of carefully weeding out what's a product of male bias and what's just true. And this is the problem, because on the other hand, she rejects what she calls essentialism, the idea that men and women are essentially different, because that implies there's an essential man, or an absolute idea of a man, and there's an absolute idea of a woman. And that is Plato's theory. And Alice Crary rejects that, and that's what confuses me, because Plato is really the founder of rational thought, at least in the West, and he's very similar to the Hindu perspective in the East, which is the foundation of philosophical thought in the East. So it's very similar worldviews. So if you're going to, on the one hand, defend reason and the entire project of abstract thinking, and yet on the other hand you're going to reject essentialism, that seems to me contradictory. I think I know what she's doing. She rejects the idea of an essential man and essential woman, but she doesn't clearly point out that there might be other essences of things, such as the essence of truth, the idea of true, or the idea of equality, absolute equality. That's also an essence, the essence of equality. So if you're going to, and those absolute ideas are what reason perceives. We are able as human beings to have these kinds of abstract thoughts because we can speak with symbols, with words. We can say tree, and that word applies to nearly an infinite. There's not an infinite number of trees on the earth, but you could assume there's an infinite number of parallel universes with an infinite number of physical trees, and that one word tree applies to them all. Then the question is there really an absolute idea of tree, and that all the other trees in the material world imperfectly participate in that idea, and that human reason knows it's a tree because we have this idea imprinted on our soul? Or is it just the product of language, that it's a shorthand way of communicating? Oh, we need to speak quickly for survival. I've talked about this before. I think it's worth bringing up now. Friedrich Nietzsche said, oh, Plato's problem was that, and he used the example of a leaf. We see a lot of leaves on a tree. We have one idea of a leaf. For language, it helps with quick communication. If you see, if you had to come up with a different word for every time you would see a different wolf, then a wolf could sneak off with the child from the tribe, and you wouldn't be able to warn other members to stop the wolf. So that doesn't help the survival value of the species. But quick communication with symbols that encompass many things, that does help survive. That helps human beings survive. And what Nietzsche said Plato did was he got mistaken with the words. He believed they're not just shorthand tools for quick communication. They refer to actual things, essential things, the idea of wolf, the idea of a tree, the idea of equality, anything you can perceive and give a name to describe in the material world is radiating from some corresponding absolute idea, all of which are united in the idea of the good. That's Plato's philosophy. That's the foundation of rational thinking in the Western world. And so, if you believe in reason, it implies you believe in these absolute ideas, these essences of things. And yet, on the other hand, Alice Crary wants to reject that there is an essential difference, or that there is an essence of what it is to be a man or a woman. And that can get complicated, of the difference between, she'll also talk about this, sex and gender. You might have the body of a male sex, with sexual organs of a male, but have the gender of a female, and vice versa. So there's a lot of different subtle things that need to be taken into consideration here. There's a difference between male and masculine and female and feminine, but the real question is, are those words related to absolute ideas? And Alice Crary will say no. I think a way she could avoid what seems to me to be this contradiction of defending reason and rejecting essences is just say, well, maybe there is an essence of the masculine and an essence of the feminine. For example, in Taoism, the essence of the masculine is yang. The essence of the feminine is yin and yang, and that's that symbol, the yin-yang, which my friend Steve Najelski calls yin-yang. He says that's the anyway, so is there really such a thing as this masculine essence and a feminine essence? Maybe there are. That doesn't mean, however, that whatever any current society or any society throughout history, they might define those essences incorrectly. I think that would be a more productive angle for anyone who's trying to articulate Alice Crary's argument, that there's this, okay, maybe there are essences, because that's what we need for rational thought, these abstract, absolute ideas. It's just the way that certain societies have defined these essences are male biased. Not to reject the idea of absolute ideas itself. All right, so that, I wanted to get that point of confusion out of the way, because it's going to be hard to describe these discussion questions without referring to all that I just said in the first 10 minutes of this video. So I am now going to go to the discussion questions on page 369. So, number one, why does Crary reject the ideas of writers such as Andrea Nye? Explain. Page 355 is where she starts to discuss Andrea Nye. And so that bottom paragraph on page 355, I'll just read the first sentence, but then we'll skip to 356. So Andrea Nye undertakes to demonstrate that the discipline which has traditionally been called logic is grounded on a philosophical confusion, and can therefore, she wants to argue, play only a distorting role in social and philosophical debates. So then she'll go on to say that Nye points out that you can interpret any philosopher's philosophy in their historical contexts and in their own personal backgrounds, and then you will see how they're, well, I'll read a little bit here at the bottom of 355. Nye's work is of value insofar as she reminds us that a thinker's presuppositions can surreptitiously inform his logical work, and that it is simple-minded to assume that the practical context of logical research cannot influence content. So, philosophers of the past grew up in male-dominated societies, and it would be naive to think that that social context hasn't influenced their ostensibly pure thinking. Fine, says Alice Crary. I'll grant you that. However, you're going to go one step too far, says Alice Crary about Andrea Nye. But Nye's, so the bottom of 355, but Nye's criticism goes deeper than a recommendation for a more complete human understanding of the achievements comprising the history of logic. She laments some philosophers' willingness to allow for the possibility of a discipline which, although it is susceptible of readings, meaning being interpreted in a social context, is valued philosophically precisely. So this is what Andrea Nye laments, that certain works of philosophy can be valued philosophically precisely because it allows us to abstract from the social context of thought in order to achieve a clearer view of the workings of thought. So Alice Crary thinks that it is possible to do that, that you can abstract your thinking from the social context in order to achieve a clearer view of the workings of thought, that we aren't necessarily imprisoned by our own prejudices, that it is possible, or at least it might be possible, to take your thinking out of your historical context and find what she'll call a space of reasons which men and women can share. So, I'll continue here. She says, she moves from the philosophically innocuous claim, so philosophically harmless claim, that the social circumstances of a logician may influence the character of his work. So she's granting that, to the hardly innocent conclusion that there can be no such thing as logic, no such thing as a discipline which, although its history can be read, meaning interpreted, can be conceived as the laying out of the conceptual structure of the space of reasons which we share. We saw that was what Immanuel Kant was trying to do in the reading before this one. So I'll read that again. Laying out of the conceptual structure of the space of reasons which we share. Crary thinks we should do that, and she thinks certain feminists like Andrea Nye are making that impossible because they say that it is impossible. And I'll read this last sentence of that top paragraph on 356. In what follows, I isolate what I see as confusions in general theoretical arguments like Nye's, arguments which wind up denying the possibility of a space of reasons which women and men can fruitfully cohabit. So that discussion question number one, why does Crary reject the ideas of writers such as Andrea Nye? She rejects them because writers like Andrea Nye reject the possibility of a space of reasons which women and men can fruitfully cohabit. They say that what seems reasonable to a man will not seem reasonable to a woman. There is no space of reasons that are not inevitably biased. And since the history of philosophy and logic that we've inherited has been predominated by men, it's natural to assume the bias will lean in favor of masculine thinking. And Alice Crary is saying, I'll grant you that masculine thinking will get in there and bias the history of thought, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible for there to actually be the space of reasons. For example, Immanuel Kant, he tried to find out what are these a priori categories of thought. And one of them he said was space itself, the idea of space. It's not empirically observable through any one of our 5 sense organs. You can't see space or smell it or taste it or touch it or hear it. Okay, well then what is it? It seems to be right in front of me, but I can't touch it or anything. That's a little bit of a riddle. And then Kant will say, well, imagine abstracting from some physical object, and the one I used was a pen. And if I hold this pen up, YouTube's going to say, oh, this will be the little thumbnail picture that goes on the video. So here we go. Take away its shape. Okay, it's no longer a cylinder. Take away its color. Okay, it's no longer black and gray. Take away its solidity. Okay, what are you left with? Empty space. All right, take away the empty space. What are you left with? More empty space. Oh, it's impossible to annihilate the thought of space. It's forced upon you. It's a category of your own mind. Space is not out there. When you observe physical objects located in space, at least the space part of that picture is not coming from the outside in, it's from the inside being projected out. You think space is out there, but really it's a lens of your own mind. Whatever sense perceptions are coming in through your sense organs are being digested and recombined for human consumption by these a priori categories of thought. A priori means before experience, before you've ever perceived anything, you've had these lenses of perception already in place. The empirical observations get the lenses going. Knowledge starts with empirical observations, Kant will admit. That doesn't mean it only consists of them. There are certain categories of thought. That's the space of reasons that Kant was trying to discover in his critique of pure reason. And he wanted to come up with this transcendental philosophy. So Alice Crary is saying, yeah, it seems to me she's saying she believes in such a thing, that we can map out the space of reasons, the a priori categories of thought. And then yet, as I pointed out, she rejects the idea of essentialism, but those are the a priori categories. Now, there is a difference between Kant's understanding of the categories of thought and Plato's absolute ideas. Plato said, oh, these are, or at least he had Socrates say, my theory is that, and I can't be absolutely certain, but my theory is that there are absolute ideas imprinted on the soul, which is eternal. The ideas are eternal, and so is the soul. What Kant will say is, well, maybe there's a soul, maybe these categories of thought are eternal, but reason doesn't permit me to claim certain knowledge about that. But I will say that there are, at any rate, ideas imprinted on the human mind. There's not necessarily a relationship between the human mind and the universe outside of our mind, but we can, at the very least, map out what are the structures of our own thought, so that we can differentiate between the incoming sense perceptions and the way those sense perceptions are organized by our mind. What is the structure of the thinking apparatus of the human mind? So they're very similar to Plato's absolute ideas, but he doesn't claim that they are all united in the idea of the good, which exists in another, another spiritual world, and projects this material world into reality. So it's a compromise between Plato's theory of absolute ideas and Hume's rejection of those ideas on behalf of empiricism. Kant bridges that gap, or at least that's what he tried to do. And so Crary, I think, would lean more towards Kant's interpretation of these a priori categories, and yet she doesn't even like the word a priori because it implies, well, for example, on page 351, the last 4 lines, she says, Actually, I'll read that bottom paragraph. She says, I begin by exploring the point of departure of some feminist theory. Many feminist theories begin as responses to women's concerns about gender bias, and then end by putting forward general epistemological claims about how a masculine bias must pervade our prevailing theoretical discourse. I will be critical of theories which, insofar as they take this form, might be described as involving a philosophical must, in their insistence that the structure of our body of knowledge must be of a particular character, i.e. one which in a specified manner encodes a masculine bias. Such theories make a priori claims about the structure of knowledge in particular areas. Okay, so when she's saying they're making a priori claims about the structure of knowledge, that implies that to do such a thing is not good. And yet that's what Kant was trying to do. He wasn't making a priori claims about the structure of knowledge. He was saying the structure of knowledge consists of a priori categories of thought. He didn't say, oh, it must be that way. He tried to reason his way to that conclusion. But, and I pointed it out before, I'll point it out again, there's this seeming imbalance or a contradiction between Crary's defending reason, the abstract space of reason, and yet rejecting essences of things, and here the word a priori, I mean, that's Kant's word. She seems to reject that. So there's this unease here. And as a matter of fact, she points out how other feminists play on this two different, if you look on page 359, this is the tensions between social constructivism and essentialism about gender. So this is what I've been talking about. She says, I'll just read various parts as I work down the page. So the arguments I am concerned with begin with an innocuous general insight about the social context of knowledge. They underline the fact that we are socialized into certain norms and describe ways in which our experience is mediated by these norms. This insight is then often elaborated into the thought that gender, as opposed to sex, which is often taken to be biologically determinative, is socially constructed. All right, so society doesn't construct your sex. You're born male or female or some combination in certain cases of the two, but so that's just natural unless you want to introduce reproductive technologies, which exist these days, but for the most part, you're born naturally according with whatever sex that you have. But then your gender is socially constructed for you. That women don't naturally behave in the feminine way as described by mainstream society, although mainstream society, let's talk mainstream society 100 years ago, that perspective of women is that's what is feminine. That is not natural. That is a product of society. That is what Alice Crary says. That is okay to say that. That's not so crazy. But so I'll just continue to read. She'll get into this whole idea of essences. So this strain of feminist thought is at odds with another feminist position, one which does not take a sociological perspective on gender, but rather embraces an essentialist view. A view asserting that women simply experience things differently from men and vice versa. Some feminist arguments that explicitly claim to embrace the former sociological perspective and reject the latter essentialist one are nevertheless implicitly committed to some version of the latter. All right, so some feminists say, no, gender is not socially constructed. Men and women are different. And as a feminist, I'm going to say I am speaking as if I am a feminist woman who takes the essentialist perspective. I would say that there is a feminine essence in the universe. It's just different from the masculine essence. And so this history of philosophy that we're receiving, it's biased by the essence of a masculine thinking, and it doesn't apply to women. Of course, I would I would, as you know, someone who's read just this book of this Introduction to Philosophy book, I'd say, well, just because let's assume there is an essence of masculine and an essence of feminine, an absolute idea imprinted on the soul, all of those pairs of opposite essences are united, according to Plato, in the idea of the good. So just because they're opposite on one level, at the deepest level, the origin of everything, they are united. And that point is never brought up. It's hardly ever brought up. People who accuse Plato of this dualism, they never bring up his idea of the good, in which all opposites are united. So he overcomes dualism. To reject dualism is itself dualistic. Oh, I'm not a dualist. Well, what are you, a monist? There's no difference between anything. Everything is just one undifferentiated, ineffable something. Well, that is itself dualistic thinking, because that definition rejects the other side of the picture, which is there appear to be separate entities. Plato, I think, is not a dualist. He says there's two worlds, and yet they're united in the one, the idea of the one, the idea of the good. So he's got both sides, the yin and the yang, like the Taoists. That's not dualism. It's overcoming dualism by embracing dualism and its opposite. Okay, although according to the Taoists, everything I just said really doesn't mean anything, because you cannot capture the Tao with words. Bergson said the same thing. But you can prepare people to have their own intuition by using words that center in on the idea that you're trying to perceive. So hopefully some of that is happening here. But continuing on page 359, so she's saying, even the feminists who reject the idea of the essences of masculine and feminine and say that they're just social constructs, nevertheless, they implicitly embrace essentialism without knowing that they're doing so. For example, to call yourself a feminist. Well, if you're saying the idea of what is feminine and what is masculine is a social construct, then you're calling yourself a feminist. Well, you're identifying with this social construct. You're identifying with the essence of the feminine, and yet you're rejecting that there is such a thing. That is what Alice Crary is trying to point out here. And I'll continue to read on this page. So she really gets into some subtle ways of taking apart people's thoughts, and then I have to try to take apart her thoughts. So it's like untying knots here. So it can seem a little tedious, but it's the nature of the beast here. Okay, so continuing here, she's on page 359. She says, as we saw, it is an implicit assumption of this claim that female experience is thoroughly and systematically different from male experience. And this is just what feminists and others, including various kinds of misogynist thinkers who are essentialists about gender, have hoped to show. This perception of ways in which our experience is mediated by social norms, when it is taken to show that our body of knowledge must be thoroughly and systematically pervaded by a masculine bias, thus becomes intertwined with an essentialist position with which it is deeply in tension. Many feminist theorists whose work is threatened by this tension fail to notice it because they waffle between two senses, in which one might understand the claim that female experience differs systematically from male experience. They trade on the ambiguity between saying that women's experience tends to differ in systematic ways from men's experience, because women's and men's experiences are both mediated by social norms which differentiate systematically between women and men, and that's what Alice Crary would agree with. And, on the other hand, saying that it is constitutive of women's experience and men's experience that they be systematically different because it is essential to what it is to be a woman and what it is to be a man that each experiences things differently. Crary rejects that alternative, that there are no essential differences between what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman. So, as I pointed out, she's pointing out here that there's this ambiguity between rejecting, women's experience is different. Both sides of this feminist argument, those who reject essentialism and those who embrace it, they both say that men and women's experiences are different. This side, who rejects essentialism, says it's because society constructs the roles and the behavioral norms for men and women artificially and unnaturally in a way that oppresses women. And this side says men and women are just essentially different, so we're living in a male-dominated society. They're incapable of understanding what women need because they're essentially different. But she's saying, Alice Crary saying, this side, which ostensibly rejects the idea of essences, they tend to kind of slip over to that camp and say men and women are essentially different, and that they'll never be able to understand each other. And that is what Alice Crary is rejecting. And then I'm pointing out that Alice Crary herself trades on this ambiguity and waffles between two senses of the idea of reason itself. She nowhere points out Plato's theory of absolute ideas, and yet she's trying to talk about this space of reasons which women and men can fruitfully cohabit on the top of page 356. But reason is the ability to perceive these abstract ideas, these what Kant would call the a priori categories of thought. If you look on page 331, in the middle of the page, the second sentence in that middle section, he says, "For reason is the faculty which furnishes us with the principles of knowledge a priori." Reason enables us to perceive what these a priori categories are. Reason enables us to understand that, two slices of cake are not equal. Because, according to Plato, we have the idea of absolute equality in our soul imprinted on our mind. And when we perceive two physical things that approximate equality but don't quite make that perfect match, because we have reason, we automatically compare those material instances to this standard of perception, this absolute idea. And the example I gave for that was two children versus two dogs. If you put two pieces of cake in front of two different children and one of those pieces is noticeably bigger, the kid who gets less is most likely going to complain, hey, that's not equal, and therefore that's not fair, that's not just. Whoever, where did the kid get this idea of equality? Maybe it was through social training, and it's just an art of, through words, and it doesn't refer to any absolute ideas, but Plato would say they had this absolute idea imprinted on their soul. If you put two pieces of cake that aren't the same size in front of two different dogs, neither dog's going to complain, they're just going to eat the cake. Although Plato would say they have the absolute ideas imprinted on their soul, which is reincarnating through bodies, the dog body is not capable of realizing what those absolute ideas are. Dogs lack reason, therefore they're incapable of having self-realization. They can't see the absolute ideas of which the soul is made. So I'm saying, to defend this idea of a space of reasons and yet reject the idea of essences of things, that's problematic. So let me, but despite that, what seems to me this kind of ambiguity in the reading, it's still a valuable reading for me because it really makes you think. She's really getting into the the core of the structure of thought. What can I know is the question we're trying to ask, and she's really trying to get down to that, which you don't often find people trying to do. So let me go to discussion question 2, page 369. How does Crary think that the ideas of Ludwig Wittgenstein, I believe that's how you pronounce it, I was never a big fan, but I haven't read enough probably. So how does her thinkings about the ideas of Ludwig Wittgenstein are helpful in combating essentialism? How does Crary think that he helps combat essentialism? I don't see that he does. I don't see that question. To me doesn't make that much sense, and that doesn't mean it doesn't make sense and I'm totally missing something. That's entirely possible, but I'll read what she's talking about, and he's talking about the idea of nonsense. When someone says something and you say that's nonsense, well, what do you really mean? That's impermissible and illegitimate. This is what Wittgenstein said on the top of page 361. She says, here, I'll just read what she says about him. It is helpful to consider this sort of argument against the background of a well-known critique developed in Wittgenstein's writings of a prevalent and very natural view of nonsense. Wittgenstein attacks views on which combinations of words fail to make sense because the thoughts that they try to express are taken to be in some way impermissible or illegitimate. He stresses that insofar as such views represent combinations of words as failing to be proper units of language on account of the nature of thoughts they endeavor to impart, they presuppose an understanding of the very combinations of words they portray as nonsensical. All right, so, what some of these feminists that Crary is criticizing have said is that men and women are essentially different, and therefore men's thought and logic won't make sense to a woman. So Crary is saying that's funny because you're using male, what you call male language and logic and sentence structure to express that opinion, and yet I understand what you're saying. But by your own reasoning, I shouldn't be able to understand what you're saying because those words shouldn't be able to communicate feminine meaning. So that seems contradictory. You're saying it's nonsense, and yet you're making sense to me, so you're left with this notion of intelligible nonsense. The bottom of page 361, they tell us that the sentences are nonsense at the same time that they provide us with an apparently intelligible rendering of what it is the sentences fail to say. So there you have that. Up at the top of page 362, Alex Crary says, both the traditional philosophical skeptic, and that would be like David Hume, and a certain kind of feminist theorists aspire to achieve what they conceive as the wholesale rejection of the conceptual resources with which we make sense of the world. And then at the middle of page 362, she says, despite this difference, there is a deep similarity between their positions. The feminist theorists I am discussing, like the skeptic, want to reject the very conceptual resources which they need to rely on to underwrite the intelligibility of what they hope to express. So like David Hume in the first part of this book about what is the self, who or what am I, Hume says there is no self. I don't perceive it with any of my 5 sense organs, and therefore it's not real. Okay, and he also rejects the idea of cause and effect because he doesn't perceive them. These are just relations of ideas, and they're helpful in life, but they don't apply to the matters of fact, the physical, empirically observable world. So he rejects the idea of absolute ideas imprinted on the soul and the idea that reason can understand the universal processes of the natural world. And he says at best we can have probable knowledge of how things will be in the future based on our empirical observations of the pattern of sequence of things in the past. Okay, that seems to make a lot of sense. Wait a minute, that does seem to make a lot of sense. That shouldn't make a lot of sense based on your rejection of these absolute ideas of reason. It should be, it seems to me you're making too much sense for someone who doesn't believe in reason as a universe, as an instrument that serves for all contingencies in the universe, which is what Descartes said. I think Hume might be able to say, I said reason does apply in the sphere of relations of ideas, and, in the sphere of mathematics, yeah, you can have certain universal absolute knowledge of mathematics, but it doesn't necessarily apply to the physical world out there. The geometry of Euclid will always work. It's absolutely true. And similarly, he might say, what I'm saying is all relations of ideas. It's just words and reason, and so we can trust reason when it applies just to the world of relations of ideas. All right, fine. But you're making comments about the actual world in which we live, and so you're saying there's no necessary link between the ideas of reason, which are human fictions created and byproducts of language, says David Hume, You say there's no necessary link between the words we use to think about things and the physical world out there that we perceive through our sense perceptions. If there even is a physical world out there, at any rate, there's no necessary link between our reason and our sense impressions. And yet he is talking about how we interact in the world of sense perceptions as if it's important to get our relations of ideas thinking properly to relate to the material world. So it gets confusing. Crary points out this confusion among feminists who reject essentialism while actually embracing it without knowing that they're doing that, and skeptics like David Hume who reject reason and yet argue very reasonably why reason is invalid. I'm sure there's different ways you could defend Hume, but the basic point is if you're going to use reason to attack reason, it seems that you're automatically undercutting your attempt. And that relates to a important quote that Crary uses several times. The first time on page 356, "The nature of the silence. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." Audre Lorde. We saw Lisa Bergen use the same quote while she was using the master's tools to try to dismantle the master's house. She was using reason to try to dismantle Plato's theory of absolute ideas. If you'll recall Lisa Bergen's argument, she was disgusted by the idea of a jellyfish potato because Plato's theory says, well, there's an idea of jellyfish, and then way over here there's an idea of potato, and if they're too far apart on our periodic chart of elements of absolute ideas, that we find it disgusting to mix them together. She then rejected her initial reaction, her disgust reaction, because she realized that's what she was thinking in terms of, and that same thinking has been the bane of women for all time, because, there's an essence of how a man should be, and there's an essence of how a woman should be. And a woman should be at the home and do what her husband says and take care of the kids and not go after higher education and not certainly get married to another woman. So all these things she was saying, that's what this theory of absolute ideas has done to women. And I'll say the same thing that I say about Alice Crary's critique of essentialism. Just because some people have defined a certain absolute idea in the past in a way that's been oppressive to any group of people doesn't mean that there is no absolute idea of something. Maybe there is an absolute idea of what a woman is, but the way it was described in the past by men, it was inaccurate. So I would suggest don't reject the idea of essences, reject the definitions that men have provided for those ideas, or at least analyze them for male bias, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Alice Crary is saying the same thing, and yet I'm thinking she seems to be throwing the baby out with the bathwater, the baby being essentialism, the idea of absolute essences of things. That is the space of reasons that men and women can fruitfully cohabit. According to Plato, I obviously incline towards that theory. So with that bias in mind, I will just move to the next discussion question. On page 369, number 3. Why does Crary reject the ideas of writers such as Janet Radcliffe Richards? Explain. All right, so Janet Radcliffe Richards on page 363, on 362, recoiling in the wrong direction. She says, there are important differences between my criticism of certain feminist arguments and charges brought against these same sorts of arguments by critics of feminism. All right, so I was thinking of some other part of this reading while I read it. Let me read it again. There are important differences between my criticism of certain feminist arguments and charges brought against these same sorts of arguments by critics of feminism. One prominent and, for my purposes, representative critic is Janet Radcliffe Richards. Radcliffe Richards worries that women will have given up too much if they relinquish certain weapons, and that's in quotes, which historically have been controlled by men. She claims that the way to cope with men's treachery is not to outlaw the use of their weapons, especially since women cannot do without these themselves, but to become expert enough in their use to prevent further harm from being done. unquote. Here, Radcliffe Richards is moved by her perception that women will continue to be dominated by men unless they come to terms with the weapons which have been used to subordinate them. She is concerned that feminists who want simply to reject male tools will be unsuccessful in their attempts to resist the instruments of their oppression. So Alice Crary says, there is a valid worry somewhere here, but Radcliffe Richards goes on without a pause to declare, quote, women should be so adept in argument that they can see what is happening if men seem to have proved that black is white instead of being driven into a baffled and furious silence. A paragraph later, she criticizes the feminist who thinks logic is something better ignored. Radcliffe Richards embraces the idea that argument and logic are weapons that women must be unwise to abandon. She thus buys into essential presupposition of the feminist arguments she wants to oppose. The assumption that there is something intelligible which women might do, which would be a wholesale rejection of male logic or of male standards of consistency in argumentation. She accepts the intelligibility of the recommendation of someone like Andrea Nye that women engage in a wholesale rejection of male logic, but she chooses not to follow this recommendation on the grounds that it would be a tactical error. Okay, so Andrea Nye said that men's thinking just cannot represent women, and that eventually women would have to create their own language, their own grammar, their own laws of sentence structure to communicate feminine thinking. And that is why Alice Crary said, all right, and so we just saw Radcliffe Richards. Radcliffe Richards basically agrees with that, but she's saying, in the meantime, while you're developing your language for women, don't stop using the male weapons of logic or you'll be dominated. As a matter of fact, you should practice using them. In my mind, what just came up was the movie that came out, I guess, within this past year, Wonder Woman. So, I mean, that's an old... I watched Wonder Woman in the 70s. And I forget the actress. I forget her name, but she lives in Potomac, Maryland. But at any rate, they were Amazons, they lived on their own island, and they practiced weaponry all day long. So that's kind of what Radcliffe Richards is suggesting, Don't reject, yeah, it's bad, and these are the weapons men use to oppress us, but let's just become adept with these weapons so we can defend ourselves. That's what Radcliffe Richards says. But let me go back to what Andrea and I was saying, that we should just reject male thinking because it'll never express the needs of women. So on page 358, the third paragraph, even those cases, however, in which we can achieve a limited analog of a wholesale rejection of things male in favor of things female, such a gesture still will not accomplish what is intended. The affirmation of the negation of a metaphysical thesis tends to issue in another metaphysical thesis, one which participates in the same picture and hence bears the image of its opposing counterpart. She's taking this from Hegel. So, you want to create a language that applies to women. Okay. Well, what's really going to happen is you're going to have a mirror opposite of the male, what you call male language. And you'll think that you've negated the male language, but in fact you've just brought out something that was already implicit within it, which is its own negative image, its own mirror reflection. And that's the word that she'll use. Continuing here, she'll say, the affirmation of the negation of a metaphysical thesis, tends to issue in another metaphysical thesis, one which participates in the same picture and hence bears the image of its opposing counterpart. The theorists I am concerned to criticize here reflect on traditional metaphysical renderings of our basic everyday concepts of objectivity, rationality, and experience, and accept these renderings as successfully representing the structure of these concepts, and then turn on them and want to reject them as fully male. So I'm going to skip down a little bit up to the next paragraph, and she'll say, and if we attempt simply to affirm the negation of these traditional metaphysical theses, imagining we are thereby exchanging male basic concepts for female ones, then we end up simply maintaining the structure of that male metaphysics reflected now in the mirror image of its antithesis. In the last sentence, she'll say, certain kinds of feminist arguments legitimize traditional male metaphysics in their very attempt to reject it. So that is what Crary said about Nye. Oh, you're trying to reject male metaphysics, and you think there should be a female metaphysics created and a whole new woman's language? Well, all you've really done is just reproduced the so-called enemy that you were trying to reject, because you just, at best, you'll be able to create a mirror image of what you're ostensibly rejecting. And that goes back to Audre Lorde's quote, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. All these feminists who reject so-called male logic are using male logic to express the need why they should reject it. And Crary's, that's the fundamental point she's trying to point out. And why does she reject Janet Radcliffe Richards? Because Radcliffe Richards, although she says women should become adept at philosophy to defend themselves, she doesn't reject the fundamental assumption that male logic is inherently necessarily biased. Not that male logic. She thinks that logic is inherently male. And Crary's saying, no, logic is for men and women. It just has been biased, but you have to differentiate between the bias and logic itself. The essence of logic, although she rejects the idea of essences, at least when it's applied to the differences between masculine and feminine. If asked, do you believe in the essence of truth? Maybe she would say yes. I don't know. All right, so the final question, evaluate Crary's position in light of the other writers in part 3 of our fundamental questions. So we've compared what she said about the skeptics, how they're similar to certain feminists, and Hume is the example of that. He rejects reason as this universal instrument that Descartes thought it was, and yet he uses reason to express that apparently universal truth that might not necessarily be a contradiction, but it starts to seem a little bit funny when you're such an enemy of the overpraising of reason, because you're using reason to explain why reason is so fallible. Yeah, okay, maybe something seems a little fishy there. I'm not going to go so far as Crary. Well, she didn't mention Hume, but she said the skeptics who are skeptical of reason and feminists who reject male reason, they both use it to express themselves. That's the fundamental point there. We compare Crary to Kant. So, here's a good one. The space of reasons. This is probably my favorite quote from Alice Crary, up at the top of page 356. So she's saying that, in what follows, I isolate what I see as confusions in general theoretical arguments like Nye's, arguments which wind up destroying the possibility of a space of reasons which women and men can fruitfully cohabit. So she believes there is a space of reasons that men and women can cohabit, and that implies there's a space of reasons all human beings can fruitfully cohabit, and I like that idea. So I'm going to go back to Kant, where he talks about the actual space of reasons. He called it a supersensible sphere. So if you look on page 320, the bottom of page 323, this is where he was showing that space is this a priori category of thought, and the idea of substance also, abstract, take an object, take my body's shape away, take its color away, take its solidity away. What are you left with? Empty space. Try to take that away, it's impossible. It's forced upon you. That's an a priori category of thought. So right after saying that, on page 323 at the very bottom, it says, of far more importance than all that has been above said is the consideration that certain of our cognitions rise completely above the sphere of all possible experience, and by means of conceptions to which there exists in the whole extent of experience no corresponding object, seem to extend the range of our judgments beyond its bounds. And just in this transcendental or supersensible sphere, where experience affords us neither instruction nor guidance, lie the investigations of reason, which, on account of their importance, we consider far preferable to and as having a far more elevated aim than all that the understanding can achieve within the sphere of sensuous phenomena. I like that idea of this transcendental supersensible sphere where these forms of reason exist. That was the image that Plato used in his dialogue, the Timaeus. Ironically, Kant attacks Plato at the bottom of page 324, and he accuses him of being like a dove who thinks she can fly faster if she could fly into the void space of pure intellect instead of having to have the air resistance of flying through the air, the void space of pure intellect. And yet, this transcendental or supersensible sphere that's beyond the sphere of sensuous phenomena is the same void space of pure intellect that Plato talked about in the Timaeus. The outermost, literally the outermost sphere encompassing the universe, all the material elements, earth, water, fire, air, ether, the outermost sphere, which he called the mother substance, which seems pertinent to feminism, is where all of the absolute ideas are imprinted. The absolute idea of tree, the absolute idea of male, female, equality, justice, all of them are imprinted and interwoven at this outermost sphere from which radiates this material world. I have also pointed out that the Stanford physicist, string theorist Leonard Susskind has that same theory, although he also rejects Plato's whole philosophy of souls and absolute ideas. Nevertheless, he says, the past, present, and the future, all of the information of the entire universe is interwoven at each point of this outermost cosmic horizon and radiates in to create this holographic illusion. That outermost cosmic horizon corresponds to the transcendental or supersensible sphere in which lie the investigations of reason at the top of page 324 for Immanuel Kant. And I think that's a good place to look for what Alice Crary is looking for, which is the space of reasons that men and women can fruitfully cohabit at the top of page 356. All right, here's another couple of comparisons to Alice Crary's writing and some other parts of this book. And actually, I'm thinking, you know what, I went over and I was looking in previous sections of the book. But I do think it's important for this one, for Sartre. He was from the first part of our book, not the third. And if this is one of the discussion questions on the exam and you want to compare Alice Crary to anyone else in the book, I'll accept that as valid. So Sartre, 140, he talks about the human being's sense of alienation from the world, forlornness, anguish, and despair. So for whatever reason, I centered in on, okay, yeah, right here, the last page of the Sartre reading, the middle paragraph. But there is another meaning of humanism. Fundamentally, it is this: man, so here we go, you see the male bias, the word man to refer to all humans. Man is constantly outside of himself. In projecting himself and losing himself outside of himself, he makes for man's existing. And on the other hand, it is by pursuing transcendent goals that is able to exist. So he's saying man is always outside of himself, because we're always trying to think about the future. And at the same time, he's saying that we have this idea of forlornness, anguish, and despair. We're just born here with no meaning, and we feel abandoned and lost in the world. That's just the human nature, according to his school of existentialism. I think that's important to keep in mind, because in the beginning of Alice Crary's reading, she talks about how certain feminists lament their feeling of alienation on page 352. So about right in the middle of the page, she says, investigations into whether or how knowledge is gendered often take as their point of departure what is described as a condition of alienation, women's powerful and often unanalyzed sense of alienation from the dominant epistemic or linguistic practices of their society. So women feel this sense of alienation, the sense of unease, of dislocations, the words that she uses repeatedly on page 352. And then on page 357, after she's started to criticize this feminist rejection of reason, this rational rejection of reason, she'll say, in the middle of page 357, I want to emphasize that in diagnosing the sources of a tone of metaphysical insistence which rings clearly in certain strands of feminist argument, my aim is to achieve a clearer view of the actual sources of women's sense of alienation. I am not arguing against feminist discoveries of de facto masculine bias in linguistic or epistemic practices or social institutions, no matter how systematic or widespread feminist inquiries reveal such biases to be, but only against the claim that such bias must be there, even in places we have not yet looked. So Crary is saying maybe your sense of alienation isn't necessarily always because you live in a world where all of our rational thought is taking place in this male-biased arena. Maybe there's other senses of sources of your sense of alienation. Sartre would say, oh, well, men feel alienated too. Every human being feels an alienation from their society. We feel alienated from our language. Bergson talked about it, the difference between analysis and intuition. You'll never know what this pen is in itself, describing it from outside perspectives using symbolic language. You'd have to become the thing and know it from within through intuition, but then you wouldn't be able to translate that experience back into symbolic language. It's the nature of language itself that makes us feel alienated from the world around us, because we are not really describing it as it is in itself. We're describing it by comparing it to other things, or in other words, by comparing it to things that it isn't. So if women feel like, oh, I'm using these words, I'm using these thought structures, and I just feel alienated from society and the universe, well, maybe the language is the cause of that, but it's not necessarily because of the male-biased sections of the language, but because of the nature of symbolic language itself. And I'll end by comparing this reading by Alice Crary to Plato's Cave Allegory, which was the first reading for part 3, What Can I Know? Or no, that was for the first part for What is Real. Yeah, this material world is not real. It's a shadow from the absolute forms. But that does also speak to this sense of alienation that a lot of women feel and think it's because of the history of male logic, which started with Plato. Well, the very root of that Platonic theory is the cave allegory, and in that very allegory he's saying, yeah, people feel alienated because we're locked up in this cave and we're chained head to foot and forced to perceive shadows of things. Of course you feel alienated. You're a prisoner of shadowy perceptions, and so you should follow, Plato would say, these words that I'm writing because they can help you have an intuition of the absolute idea of the good, which is the union of all things, male and female. You know, any pair of opposites you can think of is united in this absolute idea of the good, which can only be beheld by the eye of the soul. And that language can't describe it, but it can prepare the reader to have this intuition. And there was that good quote from Bergson that I've read before, but we've already been an hour into this video, so I'll end it there, and that ends part 3 of our book. So the next and final part of the book is part 4, and the fundamental question is, what should I do and who should I be? So that will bring us to the realm of ethics.